Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant to leave the shadows. In the year 1837, in the decaying streets of Salem, the same Salem that once drowned in witch hunts and hysteria, two orphan sisters appeared out of nowhere. They were gaunt, pale, with eyes that seemed to burn through walls of silence. No one knew their origin. No one knew their parents. Yet when asked, the sisters whispered with chilling calm, "We are not orphans. We are reborn." They claimed to be the reincarnations of the women who had been hanged during the Salem witch trials more than a century before. The names they spoke matched the records exactly. Names of women who had screamed, choked, and swung from the rope under Puritan law. And suddenly, the town of Salem, which had spent decades burying its bloody history, realized the dead may not have been buried at all. This wasn't a childish fantasy. The girls revealed details about secret rituals in the woods, about forbidden books that had supposedly been burned, and about judges who carried sins darker than the women they condemned. Their words forced old men to tremble, forced pastors to sweat behind the pulpit. For if the sisters told the truth, then the executions of Salem were not the end of the story, but the beginning of something far more sinister, a cycle of blood and memory repeating itself. And if reincarnation was real, if curses survived the grave, then what had the Puritans truly unleashed when they thought they had killed witches? But here is where it grows darker. The sisters did not merely claim rebirth. They claimed possession, that the executed witches had found a way to crawl back into flesh, to use innocent vessels, to cheat death, and mock the church that tried to silence them. They whispered that their purpose was vengeance, not survival, that the true fire of Salem had not yet begun to burn. And yet, ask yourself this, were they telling the truth, or were they being used? For history is a weapon, and Salem was not merely a town of piety, it was a laboratory of psychological control. And in 1837, those orphan sisters became pawns, or perhaps prophets, in a game older than America itself. The town wanted to dismiss the sisters as lunatics, as fragile girls conjuring phantoms to explain their suffering. But the more they spoke, the more Salem began to fracture. You see, these weren't vague mutterings or the random ramblings of children. They recited courtroom testimonies word for word. They described the exact texture of rope that cut into condemned throats, the smell of the prison cell damp with rot, even the markings scratched into the wood of the gallows beam. Records later showed that only the original trial scribes could have known such details, and those scribes had been dead for generations. The whispers spread like disease. The dead had returned. People gathered outside the orphanage to glimpse the girls, to test them, to confront them. The church elders, terrified of losing control, declared the sisters possessed. But in private, their fear went deeper. If the girls truly carried the memories of the executed witches, then perhaps Salem itself was cursed, its soil poisoned by the blood spilled in 1692. A curse doesn't die with the body. It lingers like a shadow tattooed on the land, waiting for new flesh to house it, and here lies the forbidden truth no one spoke aloud. Salem had never purged itself of the forces it claimed to hunt. The Puritans thought they burned the infection out of the colony with fire and rope. Instead, they may have carved open a doorway, a fracture in the psyche of the town, through which those forces could return again and again. The sisters were not the disease. They were the symptom. A reminder that blood debt always demands payment, but the deeper terror wasn't supernatural. It was institutional. Because soon, men of influence in Boston, men with wealth, Masonic rings and connections across the Atlantic, took an interest in the sisters. They didn't want the girls silenced. They wanted them studied. They wanted to know if memory could truly leap across generations, if trauma could embed itself in the body like a parasite. If a child could inherit a curse not from their bloodline, but from the very soil they walked upon. And so, the sisters vanished from public view, taken from the orphanage, hidden away. Salem went silent again, pretending the fire had burned out. But that was a lie. The fire had been carried elsewhere, into darker chambers of power. The records of what happened next are fragmentary, as though someone deliberately cut away the truth. But enough remains to trace the outline of a horror that was not random. It was orchestrated. After their disappearance from Salem, the sisters were taken to a secluded estate in Marblehead, a stone fortress by the sea, owned by a man whose name appeared often in Freemason ledgers and shipping contracts tied to the East India Company. His estate was known for its locked basements, its black draped halls, and its gatherings of men who were not priests, but acted like priests of another order. Here, the sisters were questioned, not to debunk their claims, but to refine them. Night after night, men in dark coats demanded that the girls recall the gallows, the screams, the curses spoken with a rope around the neck. They were asked about hidden rituals, about names that had never made it into court records. When the girls resisted, they were starved. When they faltered, they were struck. Until their voices grew cold and automatic, repeating fragments of forgotten chants like phonographs possessed by the dead. And here is where the veil thins. The sisters were not merely children anymore. They were becoming instruments. The men discovered that when the girls spoke in unison, when they recited certain names, objects in the room trembled. Candles extinguished. One guest claimed that his dead wife appeared in the corner of the chamber, her eyes hollow, her voice a whisper of despair. Another claimed the girls revealed the location of hidden gold buried under a church floor in Salem. And when they dug, they found it. Coin by coin, curse by curse, the sisters were teaching men of power that trauma itself could be weaponized. Understand this clearly. Salem had been a public theater of fear, a crude display of power over the masses. But in 1837, behind the locked doors of Marblehead, fear was no longer theater. It was science. The girls were being tested not as witches but as keys to memory, keys to belief, keys to a kind of control more dangerous than muskets or cannons. For if you can implant fear and resurrect it across generations, you do, not just rule bodies, you rule minds. The sisters, broken yet burning with something beyond human, were no longer orphans. They had become the property of men who sought to bottle the Salem curse like venom and inject it wherever they pleased. By 1838, whispers of the orphan sisters had spread far beyond Salem. Strange letters traveled by courier, written in codes that only a few men in Boston, New York, and London could decipher. Those letters spoke, not of witchcraft, but of opportunity. Imagine this. Two broken girls, carrying memories of the condemned, could speak names, summon visions, and evoke fear so deep that grown men trembled. What if such power could be harnessed, not to terrify a village, but to command nations? The Marblehead estate became more than a prison. It became a laboratory of the soul. The sisters were forced into nightly sessions before men who wore hoods embroidered with occult symbols. They weren't asked to predict the future. No, that would have been too obvious. Instead, they were ordered to repeat the words of their former lives, to relive the horrors of 1692 over and over until time itself seemed to collapse. In those moments, the sisters were not children. They were vessels channeling pure memory, pure fear, pure trauma. And the men watching realized something profound. Fear is not bound by death. It is immortal. The church had always known this. Governments knew it too. But here, in this secret chamber, the lesson crystallized. If you could make people relive the horrors of the past, if you could resurrect buried fears at will, you could bind entire generations to obedience. The witch trials had been an accident, a frenzy of superstition. Now they were being studied as a manual, a system. The sisters began to change. Their eyes grew hollow, their speech patterned, almost mechanical, yet sometimes, when they were left alone, they spoke in whispers that terrified even their captors. They said they were no longer alone inside themselves, that other voices had entered, that they were not merely remembering witches, they were becoming them. The line between reincarnation and indoctrination blurred, until even the men controlling them were unsure who was truly in charge. And it is here, my friend, where the forbidden truth takes shape. Salem was not just history. It was the blueprint for psychological control systems that endure even now. Fear of witches became fear of heretics. Fear of heretics became fear of radicals. Fear of radicals became fear of enemies invented by governments to bind the masses. The system adapts, but its skeleton was carved in Salem and perfected through children like those sisters. The sisters' captivity dragged on, and by the second year they no longer spoke like children. Their voices carried a cadence older than their bodies, a rhythm that unsettled even the hardened men who commanded them. One moment they cried in the voices of terrified girls, the next they spoke with chilling authority, declaring judgments in the names of the executed women of 1692. It was as though their captors had conjured a chorus of the dead inside fragile flesh. But the real horror was not mystical, it was psychological. The men discovered something staggering. Identity itself could be split, broken, and rebuilt. When the sisters were deprived of food, sleep, and light, their minds fractured. In those fractures, new personas emerged, each one tied to a different witch of Salem. What you know today as dissociative identity disorder was, in that basement, weaponized deliberately. The girls became archives, repositories of stolen lives and stolen fears, and this is where the blueprint sharpens. If identity can be broken and remade, then any human being can be rewritten. A child could be reshaped into a soldier who never questions orders. A prisoner could be fractured until loyalty replaces memory. A population could be molded to carry guilt from crimes they never committed, fear of enemies they never saw, shame that shackles them tighter than iron chains. Salem was never about witches, it was about the engineering of fear. And in 1837, those sisters were the prototype. The men tested how far this could go. They taught the sisters to deny their names, then forced them to recite new ones until they believed them. They stripped away their sense of time until one swore it was still 1692, another insisted it was 1704. Through repetition, trauma, and isolation, the girls became programmable. And here lies the unspoken revelation. Institutions have used this same formula for centuries. Schools, prisons, churches, governments, all wielding trauma, repetition, and isolation as tools of control. But ask yourself this, were the sisters simply victims? Or were they something more? Because as their captors molded them into vessels of fear, strange phenomena began to ripple outward. People near the estate reported nightmares. Servants whispered of hearing voices echoing in empty halls. Some swore that the sisters' fractured identities had grown so strong they no longer needed bodies to speak. The town tried to dismiss the sisters' words as childish rambling, but the weight of history gave their claims a venomous edge. Remember, this was Salem, where the soil itself was thick with blood, where names like Tituba, Rebecca Nurse, and Giles Corey were not distant history, but whispered ghosts. Families who had sent their daughters to the gallows were still alive. Sons of accusers still walked the streets. The past wasn't past, it was alive, festering, So when the girls said they were witches reborn, no one laughed. Some shuddered, some prayed. And others, those in power, saw an opportunity. Two orphan sisters, fragile and alone, became the perfect vessels for an old fear that had never been exorcised. The churches whispered of curses that returned through bloodlines, of sins revisiting themselves upon new flesh. The townsfolk whispered too, but with a different tone, fascination. They wanted to see if the curse was real. They wanted proof. And proof often demanded blood. This is how the system feeds itself, by turning human suffering into ritual. The sisters became both spectacle and scapegoat, a reminder of Salem's triumph over evil and a justification for its continued hold on the minds of the people. To study them, to interrogate them, to punish them. Wasn't this just another sermon, another act of worship to the invisible machinery of control? Because here lies the forbidden truth. Salem was never about witches. It was about obedience. It was about testing how much terror the human mind could hold, how much guilt it could carry, how thoroughly an identity could be shattered and remade. The sisters, with their claims, tore open the wound, and the system could not resist digging its fingers into it. At night, villagers claimed to see candles flickering in the orphanage windows, strange shadows moving against the panes, whispers threading through the silence. But whether these were ghosts or projections of the town's collective guilt doesn't matter. What mattered is the fear it produced, the exact energy those in control always crave. And so the sisters were not treated as children, but as subjects of an experiment. They were watched, tested, questioned, not because anyone truly believed they were witches, but because the system wanted to see how far trauma could bend the mind, how deeply fear could shape reality. Do you see? Even then, the machinery of psychological control was running, perfecting itself in the lives of two powerless orphans. And it worked, until the girls began to fight back. The estate at Marblehead became a crucible, and from it radiated something the world was not prepared to confront. By 1840, rumors spread through Boston, New Haven, even as far as New York. Whispers of two sisters who could call the dead by name. Men of power traveled discreetly, not to silence them, but to witness. They gathered in the darkened halls, sitting in a circle as the girls, gaunt, trembling, their voices eerily synchronized, began to chant. And in those sessions, grown men wept, screamed, or collapsed into convulsions. What the sisters produced was not merely seance, it was psychological invasion. When they recited the names of Salem's condemned, every man present felt as if he were the executioner, as if he himself had tied the rope or struck the blow. The girls forced them to relive the sins of history as though those sins were their own. Do you see the brilliance in this horror? They weren't just recalling memory, they were implanting it. They were teaching the most powerful men in America what it felt like to carry ancestral guilt. And those men, whether bankers, judges, or ministers, left the estate with a new weapon. For guilt is as powerful as fear. A population burdened with inherited guilt can be steered, manipulated, and silenced. Teach a man he is cursed, that he carries the sins of his fathers, and he will kneel without a chain. This was the forbidden lesson drawn from the sisters. That memory can be forged, identity can be rewritten, and control does not require whips when the mind itself is enslaved. But the sisters were not content to be tools. Their fractured voices began to shift in tone, sometimes mocking the men, sometimes commanding them. One night they declared, "We are many, and we are older than Salem." The words silenced the chamber. For the first time, the men saw not children, not vessels, but something else gazing back through those hollow eyes. Something that had waited centuries for this very moment. The estate grew notorious in whispers. Servants called it the House of Returned Voices. Travelers claimed they could hear chanting carried by the sea wind, even when miles away. Yet still, the sessions continued. Why? Because the men who should have destroyed the sisters knew, deep down, that what they had stumbled upon was not just supernatural, it was the blueprint of power itself. By the early 1840s, the sisters' reach extended far beyond Marblehead's locked chambers. Their words, filtered through the pens of trembling men, began to shape sermons, laws, and even political speeches. You would never hear their names spoken in public, but their influence dripped silently into the bloodstream of the young American Republic. What had begun as a local horror in Salem was now mutating into a national doctrine. Consider this. In private circles of Boston's elite, whispers circulated that the sisters had revealed a principle darker than witchcraft, that memory itself could be manufactured and weaponized. If a generation could be forced to believe in curses it never earned, then entire populations could be controlled through collective shame. This became a quiet experiment, hidden in churches and schools. Children were told not just the sins of their youth, but the sins of their forefathers. Sins that could never be cleansed, only atoned for through obedience. Guilt became inheritance. Fear became legacy. This was the Salem system reborn, disguised, not as hysteria, but as morality. And do you think this stayed contained? Hardly. From Marblehead to New Haven to Washington, small circles of men studied how belief could sculpt identity. They began to craft narratives not to describe history, but to engineer it. Stories of enemies, curses, unseen threats, designed to keep the people vigilant, submissive, and desperate for protection. Nations thrive on such fear. Religions are built upon it. Salem was no longer a cautionary tale, it was the manual. Meanwhile, the sisters themselves had become less like children and more like conduits of a force no man could master. In their presence, clocks stopped. Guests reported feeling their ancestors' crimes pressing down on their chests, choking them with invisible rope. Some fled in terror. Others swore loyalty to the very power that haunted them. And in this way, the sisters carved their influence not through armies or guns, but through the psyche. But here is the truth you were never meant to know. Every empire, every church, every government that survived did so not by brute strength, but by mastering. The Salem formula: instill fear, embed guilt, fracture identity, then offer the cure. The sisters did not invent this system. They revealed it, embodied it, and forced the elites of 19th century America to perfect it. Now pause and ask yourself, have you felt it? The weight of sins you never committed? The invisible rope tightening around your neck? If you have, then the system that began in Salem is still alive, still working on you. By 1842, the sisters' presence had become a magnet for secret orders. Freemasons, Rosicrucians, even the shadowy offshoots of Puritan bloodlines gathered in Marblehead to witness what they called the living archive. The girls no longer needed prompting. Their fractured voices slipped effortlessly between the condemned of 1692, the pastors who judged them, even the whispers of dead children lost to fever and famine. Every identity was a thread, and the sisters were weaving them into a tapestry so vast it terrified even their captors. But the society saw opportunity. They realized that if memory could be implanted, then tradition itself could be manufactured. Imagine it. Rewrite the past, and you reshape the present. Teach men that they descend from cursed bloodlines, and they will serve you to atone. Convince nations that enemies lurk in every shadow, and they will march obediently to war. The Salem formula, fear, guilt, fracture, obedience, was no longer an accident of history. It was now a conscious tool in the hands of elites. One diary from a Mason present at Marblehead reveals something chilling. The sisters have given us not prophecy, but machinery. Memory is clay, Guilt is the mold. We will shape nations as easily as a potter shapes earth. Do you see the implication? The Salem trials had birthed not hysteria, but a prototype of mass control, a prototype refined by the torment of two orphans until it became indistinguishable from sacred truth. But the sisters themselves were shifting. They began speaking of visions not rooted in Salem, but in futures yet to come. Visions of cities burning, of soldiers fighting wars over invisible enemies, of entire nations collapsing under the weight of invented guilt. To their captors, these visions were warnings. To the societies, they were blueprints. The sisters had become prophets of power, yet the men could not contain them forever. Servants who fled Marblehead carried stories to the outside world. Small towns whispered of the reborn witches who haunted men of influence, and in that whispering, the sisters' legend spread beyond secrecy. Even those who never saw them began to believe, and belief once seeded is the most dangerous contagion of all. Now understand this, you are not simply hearing a story of two orphans. You are hearing the roots of every system of control that still binds you today. Salem was the spark. Marblehead was the forge, and the fire has never gone out. By the mid-1840s, the American Republic was expanding, building railroads, stretching its grasp westward, presenting itself as a young nation of freedom. But beneath the speeches, beneath the patriotic hymns, a darker current flowed. Men who had sat in Marblehead's chambers, politicians, bankers, clergymen, now carried with them a secret they could never confess. The formula of control learned from two broken sisters. They didn't just study it, they applied it. Look at the institutions rising in this period: public schools, asylums, reform houses, new churches swelling with fire and brimstone sermons. Each of them carried the Salem blueprint. Break the child, fracture the mind with fear of eternal punishment, repetition of ritual, isolation from anything that might contradict the lesson, then offer redemption, but only through obedience. Does it not sound familiar? The classroom, the pew, the prison cell, all operating not as places of growth, but as machines of identity engineering. And ask yourself, why did America, a nation that claimed liberty, invest so heavily in controlling the psyche of its people? Because the men who sat with the sisters learned a truth too powerful to ignore. Chains on the body are fragile. Chains on the mind are eternal. The sisters showed them that if you embed fear deep enough, the people will chain themselves, but the sisters themselves were no longer passive. Their voices, fractured yet commanding, began to twist into something sharper. Witnesses recorded them laughing as men wept, mocking judges with the voices of long-dead women declaring, "You cannot escape us. You carry us in your blood." Even as the elites sought to master them, the sisters were mastering the elites. Some men left Marblehead convinced that they had been cursed, that their families would forever carry the weight of Salem's nooses. Others became zealots, believing the girls were vessels of divine punishment. Both reactions served the same purpose: submission. Soon, the estate was abandoned. Officially, it was said to have burned. Unofficially, the sisters vanished, absorbed into networks that never let their tools disappear. But whether they lived or not ceased to matter. Their lesson had already been planted like a parasite in America's institutions. And here is the forbidden truth. What began in Salem, perfected through the sisters, still beats at the heart of your world today. The fear of enemies you've never met. The guilt for crimes you never committed. The identity fractured until you no longer know who you are without the chains. By the late 1840s, the sisters had dissolved into myth, but myths are more dangerous than flesh. Flesh dies. Myths multiply. In Boston's hidden halls, in New York's candlelit lodges, in Washington's secret chambers, men spoke of them not as orphans but as archetypes, the reborn witches of Salem, vessels of a power older than the Republic itself. Their influence no longer depended on their physical presence. It had been absorbed into ritual, etched into the secret ceremonies of the societies that fed America's rising empire. Freemasons began adapting Salem-like trials into their initiations, not crude hangings, but psychological fractures. Candidates were blindfolded, starved of certainty, forced to confront imagined guilt. The Rosicrucians used the sisters' lessons to teach that memory could be implanted, identity dissolved, and truth reshaped. Even ministers who denounced witchcraft from the pulpit quietly borrowed the formula, wrapping congregations in shame, then selling redemption back to them as obedience. And ask yourself, how do nations bind millions of strangers into obedience? Not with force, not with guns, with belief, with fear, with carefully constructed myths that fracture the self and replace it with an identity chosen for you. The sisters showed the blueprint, and America, hungry for control of its restless population, took it and built an empire. There are letters buried deep in archives that reveal a chilling alignment. Politicians discussing how schools should instill discipline of conscience. Bankers funding religious revivals not for salvation, but for stability. Judges writing of the necessity of inherited guilt as a social glue. These men had seen Marblehead. They had heard the sisters' voices. They knew that controlling memory meant controlling destiny. Meanwhile, outside the chambers of power, ordinary citizens began whispering about curses, reborn witches, and shadows of Salem walking the earth again. But here lies the manipulation. Those whispers were allowed, even encouraged. Why? Because fear must always exist at the bottom if it is to be exploited at the top. Superstition for the masses, science of control for the elite. Two sides of the same coin, and here's the revelation they never wanted you to see. The same blueprint still runs today. Fear rebranded, guilt recycled. Institutions as marble prisons for the psyche. And the ghost of Salem, through the sisters, still whispers through it all. By the 1850s, the legend of the Orphan sisters was no longer confined to New England. Their story had crossed the Atlantic, carried by ship captains, society men, and priests who moved between Boston, London, and Paris. In Europe, whispers spread of two American children who had spoken with the voices of the dead, who had revealed that memory was clay and identity a mask. The story ignited interest among secret orders that had long practiced their own rituals of guilt, confession, and rebirth. For them, the sisters were not anomalies, they were proof. Proof that the human mind could be shattered, emptied, and filled again. The British elite studied the case like a weapon manual. If inherited guilt could enslave a man, then entire empires could be built on it. They had already mastered the use of religion to control colonies. But here was something even more potent. Psychological programming disguised as divine punishment. You could fracture conquered populations by teaching them their ancestors were cursed, their traditions sinful, their very identities unworthy. Then you offer them a new identity, one loyal to empire, one desperate to obey. And so the Salem system merged with Europe's older machinery. Jesuit schools perfected the rhythm of shame and redemption. Masonic lodges refined the rituals of symbolic death and rebirth. Political leaders learned to weaponize enemies within as justification for surveillance and control. The sisters, broken voices, had become the seed of a system that stretched across oceans, infiltrating parliaments, pulpits, and prisons alike. But here lies the darker truth. The sisters had spoken of visions, cities burning, nations collapsing, wars fed by fear. And in Europe, men listened not as warnings, but as strategies. What if wars themselves could be manufactured? What if entire populations could be fractured by design, turned against each other in cycles of fear and guilt? The sisters' suffering had revealed not just the power of control, but the inevitability of chaos when fear becomes the air a people breathe. Meanwhile, in America, the legend mutated further. Traveling preachers invoked the sisters as proof that Salem's sins still stained the land. Politicians spoke of hidden enemies eroding the nation from within. And ordinary men, though they never saw the sisters, felt their influence in sermons, in classrooms, in the very way they were taught to see themselves as cursed, as guilty, as forever in need of authority. Understand this. By then, the sisters didn't need to exist in flesh. They had become an idea, and ideas, especially those forged in trauma, do not die. They spread, infect, and replicate across centuries. By the dawn of the 1860s, America stood on the edge of fire. The Civil War is taught as a struggle over slavery, over state rights, over the fate of the Union. But beneath the flags and speeches lurked something older, an infection that had never been cured since Salem. The Orphan sisters' formula, fear, guilt, fracture, obedience, had already spread into pulpits and politics. Now it was being applied to an entire nation. Think about it. The North was taught that the South carried an ancestral curse, that they were morally damned, their sin unforgivable, their shame inescapable. The South, meanwhile, was taught that the North sought to erase their identity, to strip them of heritage, to enslave them under a new moral empire. Each side carried guilt, each side carried fear, each side was fractured to the core. And the result? Brothers turned on brothers, families ripped apart, a nation drowned in blood. The Salem system scaled from a village to a continent. But here's the forbidden truth. This was not chaos. This was strategy. In the very letters of secret societies, you find chilling parallels to Marblehead, discussions of how to preserve order after the war, how to ensure guilt and fear remained embedded in the national psyche, how to use trauma itself as the cement for a stronger state. The war was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in the minds of men, where identity was rewritten, fractured, and chained to authority. And the sisters, though no longer seen, their legend resurfaced in strange ways. Soldiers swore they heard the voices of women crying in the night, whispering curses before battles. Some regiments reported visions, dreams of hanging trees and burning towns that mirrored the Salem trials. Were these hallucinations of traumatized men or echoes of the same curse that had haunted Marblehead? It almost didn't matter. Belief was the weapon, and belief had already taken root. After the war, America stood scarred and broken. And what was the solution? Reconstruction, not just of buildings and laws, but of minds. New institutions rose to teach both victor and vanquish their guilt, their shame, their dependence on authority. The Salem formula endured, more powerful than ever, and you must ask yourself, who gained from this fracture? The common man bled, families starved, but the institutions, church, state, finance, grew stronger. This was not the end of the sisters' curse. It was its evolution. As the smoke of the Civil War cleared, America rushed headlong into the industrial age. Railroads carved the land like scars, factories belched soot into the sky, and millions of men became cogs in a machine that promised progress but delivered chains of a new kind. And if you look closely, you will see the fingerprints of Salem's curse here too. The formula had not vanished, it had adapted. Factories did not simply demand labor, they demanded obedience, repetition, submission of identity. Men who had once been farmers, hunters, craftsmen, masters of their own rhythms, were now told when to rise, when to eat, when to move, when to stop. The whip of the overseer had been replaced by the clock, but beneath it all was the same architecture. Of control the sisters had revealed. Fracture the individual, erase his independence, then bind him to guilt and fear. Fear of unemployment, guilt for failing his family, fear of hunger, guilt for not sacrificing enough for the machine. Schools, too, became factories of the mind. Rows of children drilled in silence, bells commanding obedience, lessons repeated until individuality fractured into conformity. They were taught not just arithmetic, but obedience to authority, guilt for disobedience, fear of standing apart. Sound familiar? It was Salem all over again. Trauma, repetition, isolation. But now it wore the mask of progress. And still, the legend of the Orphan sisters lingered. In whispered folk tales they were said to appear in factories at night, pale, figures staring at workers bent over machines, whispering, "Do you know whose chains you wear?" Of course, the managers dismissed it as superstition. But the workers knew the truth in their bones, that the curse of Salem had not been about witches at all. It had always been about control. Secret societies flourished in this new age, their rituals echoing Marblehead's lessons. Initiates were broken, humbled, then rebuilt in the image of the order. Factories, schools, prisons, armies, all mirrored the same formula, like branches from the same poisoned root. And at the core was the lesson the sisters had embodied. Fracture. The self, implant fear, bind with guilt, then offer redemption through obedience. Do you see now? Salem was not an isolated madness. It was the seed, the sisters were the soil, and the industrial age was the harvest. Millions of men chained not by rope, but by ideas, made to believe their suffering was necessary, even righteous. You've walked with me this far, deeper than most men ever dare. You've seen how 2 forgotten orphans in 1837 were not anomalies, but messengers, unwilling prophets of a system designed to fracture your mind, feed on your guilt, and bind your soul to obedience. And now I must ask you, do you feel it? Do you feel the weight pressing on your chest, the recognition in your gut, the quiet terror that perhaps you've carried these chains your whole life without seeing them? That is not imagination. That is the system at work. But here is where the descent becomes dangerous. Once you recognize the system, you can never return to blindness. You cannot unsee the ropes of guilt, the architecture of fear, the manipulation of your very identity. You begin to ask questions you were never meant to ask. Who benefits from my guilt? Who profits from my fear? Who wrote the script of my life before I even learned to speak? These questions tear the veil, and when the veil tears, you are no longer a subject. You are something far more threatening. The men who shaped this world understood one truth. The easiest way to control a man is to convince him he is already cursed. And so you were taught to carry shame for your blood, your desires, your strength. You were told you were dangerous, unworthy, in need of permission to live freely. That was Salem's curse perfected. But listen closely. Chains made of guilt dissolve the moment you no longer accept them. Fear loses its power the moment you face it. Identity cannot be fractured if you refuse to give it away. This is where you mark yourself. This is where you declare you've seen behind the mask. I want you to write in the comments twice, to etch it into your mind and into the algorithm of this message. I carry no chains. Again, I carry no chains. When you do, you're not simply leaving a comment. You're declaring war on the system that has fed on you since birth. You are refusing the inheritance of fear and guilt, rejecting the blueprint that has enslaved men for centuries. And once you say it, you can never be the same again. Now we move into the final descent, into the closing revelation. For in the last chapter you will see the ultimate truth, that the orphan sisters of Salem were not merely victims or monsters, but mirrors showing us the face of the system itself. This is the end of the descent, and if you're still here, you already know why. Because something inside you recognized the orphan sister's story was never about the past. It was about you. About the invisible architecture built around you long before you were born. About the chains you were told were part of your nature, when in truth they were crafted to keep you bent, obedient, and blind. The Orphan Sisters of Salem. 2. Broken children declared witches reborn were never the villains. They were the blueprint. Their lives showed how trauma could be weaponized, how guilt could be implanted, how fear could be multiplied until a whole community bowed to invisible masters. That blueprint was studied, refined, institutionalized. It infected schools, pulpits, armies, governments. And now, it pulses in the digital wires of this very moment, binding millions in the same chains the sisters first carried. But here is the final revelation, the one truth that makes this knowledge dangerous. The curse of Salem was never supernatural. It was psychological. And what is psychological can be broken. The sisters were not witches. They were mirrors, showing every man the system he was trapped in. If you see it, truly see it, you are no longer prey. You are no longer guilty. You are no longer afraid. The men of Marblehead believed fear kept them safe. The industrial lords believed guilt made men obedient. The institutions of today believe your fractured self will keep you enslaved forever. But here you are, carrying no chains, staring back at the system with eyes it cannot close again. That is power. That is why this story had to be buried, why the sisters had to be erased. Because the moment one man refuses the curse, others follow. And the spell begins to crack. So remember the lesson. Guilt is the weapon, fear is the leash, fracture is the method. Refuse them, and the architecture collapses. Salem is not just history. Salem is every church that tells you you're damned unless you kneel. Salem is every classroom that punishes questions. Salem is every system that demands your obedience while feeding on your silence. The sisters never died. They live in every man who opens his eyes and whispers to himself, "I carry no chains." And now you've whispered it. The descent is complete. The curse is broken. The only question left is, what will you do with the power you've just stolen back?